Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to break down a really profound teaching on the very nature of reality. It comes from an ancient Buddhist text called the Kaccanagotta Sutta. Now, it's a short text, but whoa, its message is incredibly powerful. Okay, so let's just dive right in. Here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at a simple, timeless question. Then we'll explore two huge mental traps we all fall into. After that, we'll talk about walking the middle way and see how that whole idea explains where stress comes from and how it ends. And finally, we'll land on what right view actually is. So our whole explainer kicks off with a scene that, honestly, feels super modern. You've got a student, a monk named Kaccanagotta, and he goes up to his teacher, the Buddha, with this really fundamental question about a term he keeps hearing over and over. He's basically asking, look, everyone's always talking about right view. What does that actually mean? What's the real deal? It's a question that just cuts through all the noise, and it's a question people have been wrestling with for centuries. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The Buddha's response, well, he doesn't just hand over a simple definition. Instead, he starts by pointing out this giant mental trap that, frankly, prevents most of us from seeing things clearly in the first place. He explains that, for the most part, we all get stuck in this polarity, this really rigid, black and white way of looking at the world. We tend to see everything through this absolute lens of either existence or non-existence. Something either is or it isn't, period. And he puts a name on it. He calls these two absolute positions, that everything is permanent and solid or that nothing exists at all, the two extremes that just trap our minds. He's suggesting that this binary view, it kind of misses the more subtle, more dynamic truth of how things really are. And this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate, right? This all-or-nothing thinking has real-world consequences. It leads to a mind that's in bondage, a mind that's all tangled up in attachments, biases, and obsessions. We cling to things because we think they're solid and real, where we fall into total despair, thinking nothing matters at all. Okay, so if thinking it exists is a trap, and thinking it doesn't exist is also a trap, then what's left? What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to see the world? And this is where he introduces his big idea, the middle way. Now, this isn't some wishy-washy compromise in the middle, not at all. It's more like a really skillful, dynamic path that navigates between those two poles without ever getting stuck on either one. So how does this middle way actually work in practice? Well, the Buddha explains it by showing how our own stress gets built piece by piece. And spoiler alert, it's not a solid thing that exists. It's a process. It's a causal chain. He lays out this incredible chain reaction, like a series of dominoes. And the wild part is, it all kicks off with one thing, a fundamental misunderstanding of reality, what he calls ignorance. From that single starting point, this whole cascade just begins. Our mental habits fire up, that leads to our sense of self, which leads to our senses, and eventually to how we make contact with the world. And believe me, the dominoes just keep on falling. Contact leads to feeling. Feeling leads to craving. Craving leads to clinging. Each step automatically triggers the next, building and building until it results in what the Buddha calls the entire mass of stress and suffering. But here's the absolute key. It's a process, not a permanent state. Okay, but here's where it gets really hopeful. This is the cool part. That whole causal logic, that chain reaction, it also works perfectly in reverse. If stress is something that gets built through a process, it can also be unbuilt through a process. The Buddha basically says, hey, if you can just deal with that very first link in the chain, if you can replace that initial ignorance with genuine clarity, the whole process starts to unravel. You take out the first domino, and the rest just can't fall. And this is just such a brilliant illustration of the path to freedom. As each link in the chain ceases, the next one has no cause, no fuel to arise. Craving stops, clinging stops, and so on all the way down the line, until that entire mass of stress and suffering just dissolves. So, after laying out this whole amazing dynamic process of arising and ceasing, the Buddha finally circles all the way back to Kaccana's original simple question. Okay, so what is right view? And the answer is so simple, yet so profound. He says the person with right view sees this whole process with total clarity. They don't get tangled up in abstract ideas about whether their stress exists or doesn't exist. They just see it for what it is. When it's arising, they see it arising. When it's passing away, they see it passing away. No story, no drama, that's it. So you see, right view isn't some new belief system you have to sign up for or some philosophy you need to defend. It is a direct, unshakable perception of this dynamic, moment-to-moment process that makes up our whole experience. It's about seeing the world as a verb, not a noun. And this, I think, is the most empowering part of the whole teaching. This kind of understanding doesn't come from believing a teacher or memorizing a book. It comes from your own direct observation. It becomes a knowledge that is completely independent of others because you have seen it for yourself. And so this ancient text leaves us with a really provocative question for our own lives right now. What would change for you today if you stopped treating your problems, your anxieties, your very identity as solid, permanent things that exist, and instead learned to see them simply as processes that arise and just as surely cease? That is definitely something to think about.